I guess with the doors being shut, that means it's 4, right? All right. My name is Paul Boos. I'll show a little bit about myself. I'm going to be talking about how, if you have an agile aspiration for making your organization take on agility, how you make that transformation. So this is going to be a fairly fast flight. I've got a lot of ground to cover to get across the continent. I am going to mention a lot of techniques that we can go very deep in if I were to do that. If I were to try to dive down from flight level 250 to Angels 300, we would be here all day. So I'm going to purposely just try to go through the entire approach, and then you'll be able to at least have an understand how it hangs together. And then there'll be there is a couple places that I will go a little deeper in, but that's because there are concepts related to this particular approach. So with that, a little bit about me. I've been doing software quite a while, management even a little longer, Deming, re-engineering, lean startup, all sorts of stuff like that. I'm currently a software leadership coach with Santion. So I've been doing that and bringing a lot of my experience from product companies and government contracting and stuff and dealing with agile development since about 2006 or so, 5, somewhere in that range, to Santion. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what I mean by an agile transformation or transition or adoption. I don't care which word you want to use per se. The 3 basic things is we want to get better results. And you always hear about better results for the company, the organization, but we also want better results for ourselves. If we remember, one of the principles is to have a sustainable pace, and we had a great discussion dealing with oppression and how we want to have a sustainable pace in Damon Poole's last session and during session 4. So one of the things we're trying to get better results for both the business and ourselves. To do this, we're going to have to make some kind of change. And a quick show of hands, how many people think we only need to make the change in IT? Right, so that's we have to make the change much beyond that. And how we're going to do that is we need to take this change and operationalize it in order to and be able to support sustaining change. All right, the change is not going to stop. I don't transform and I'm all of a sudden agile. That's not it. You've probably heard the comment about agile is the journey, not the destination. And we're going to use an aspirational target in order to get there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. One thing we need to recognize is this is strategic in nature, right? It's not a little tiny compartment. When I can do experiments around teams and I may roll things out a team at a time, but eventually I am making a very strategic case in how I move forward. All right, it's a very strategic decision to decide I want to become an agile organization. So what I mean by that is if it's strategic, it's more than just munching a bunch of agile practices one after another, right? It's not Pac-Man, but we're going to take a look at that a little bit. There are things that we need to do along the way, and things we need to eat in our dog food in order to get there. This is not easy. There's no magic fairy dust, although a lot of people like to go and CIOs go fix that, make us agile, and they think we can just sprinkle some magic fairy dust and we're done, we're agile. So what makes it hard? It's culture. So the first thing I'd like to bring home is that it's agile culture. If we take a look at the last 3 years, the top 5 barriers, all of this stuff points to culture. It tends to be why we fail when we try to transform. So we've got to take a look at why is our culture getting in the way. The orange one is something, project complexity, not directly related to culture, but is somewhat related to culture. And I will talk a little bit toward the end about biases and assumptions that we make that I think hint toward project complexity showing up fairly often. Peter Drucker said this. Well, he might have used lunch. I can't remember. It changes every time I read it. But basically, culture eats strategy. I can create this great strategy, but if I don't address the cultural issue, I'm not going to get anywhere. So we're going to focus a lot up front on dealing with the culture. And then to do that, I've got 3 different models. I like to look at 3 different ways of looking at culture. You sort of need to use all 3 of these, all right? If you only use one, you're just getting a piece of the picture. You need to look at all 3 perspectives. So the first one I like to think of as culture is the summation of the people's identity, which then they have values, beliefs, behaviors, and then actions eventually result out of that. So this summation of the people we have brings us a common denominator of what our culture looks like. So what that means, if I don't think of humans when I'm trying to change culture, and I think I can just mandate it, I'm not going to get anywhere, because this is all people. I have an identity, somebody else has an identity. It may be more around work, maybe more around family, whatever it happens to be, but you have an identity. And eventually we all sum up to create a cultural identity. All right, so this is one model, and there's some great exercises that get based off that model. Another one is William Schneider created this really good model of where we look at things on an axis of being organizationally centric, where we care mostly about the organization, to being people-centric, and we care more about the people and how we do our work and how we work together. We also have another axis of where I want to be reality-oriented. I'm grounded in how I'm approaching things based on reality. Or I might want to be possibility-oriented, where I want to go. So, for example, if I'm a firefighting team, I'm way over here. I'm very people-centric, working together. I'm totally focused on putting out the fire and saving people. That's very reality-oriented. So I'm up in that upper left-hand quadrant. I'm probably very collaborative, is what they would say. Likewise, if I'm more like an apple and I want to be the best, I'm looking for having that next generation. I'm thinking about the organization, but I'm very future-forward thinking. I might be more down in this competency organization. Just another way of throwing the quadrant. And of course, I have control-based, where I'm fighting fires, but I'm doing it only for the organization standpoint. And I have where I want to develop people and develop their possibilities and allow them, and that could be a cultivation. So how would I use this? Well, I can take characteristics. These are probably going to be fairly subjective. Some of them might be able to be measured, but you have to recognize that some are going to be subjective. And I can plot these characteristics along this graph. And where I get a large cluster, then that's going to be my dominant culture, right? I can have subcultures like this department. R&D may be more down in competency, whereas my overall organization may be more in control, a control organization. I may have other parts that are very helpful. Maybe I have a help desk and they tend to be more collaborative, for example. But I'm going to have a dominant culture for the organization, then I may have subcultures that run across that. I can also have a culture that sort of straddles borders. This, while I'm divided in quadrants, I can have things that, it's a measured graph, right? So I can have stuff that shows up in the middle on any of the axes and maybe even dead center. So my dominant culture is not necessarily in a quadrant per se, although generally you're going to find that it has some leeway in one direction or the other. I also recommend, if you're going to use this, that you one, recognize where you currently are, but also recognize where you want to be. Take a look at characteristics and where do they plot, and how does that match where you are now? Because that's going to be the way you want to change, and we'll go more into that a little bit later. And then the third model that I like using, I adopted from Ahmed Sidki, who gave a talk earlier this morning. We have all these different things that make up what our organization does: process, practices, structure. In the middle, we have a vision. Whether we've articulated it or not, we at least have a vision in use. If I want to start changing something, like let's say I want to start adding some new practices, it's going to bounce against this membrane called culture, and it's going to get pushed back, right? So if I try to push it forward a little bit, and I only worry about this, it's going to hit a bubble, and it's just going to bounce back. So what that means, if these molecules in here of things, I need to change more than one, and then that will push it in a direction I want to go. All right, so those are the three models that I just want you to keep in mind as we walk through this. Now, why do we care about culture again, besides it being the roadblock? Well, culture, turns out, there's this great book back in 1982. It was a New York bestseller. It was talking about economic change. But the guts of the thing said that, hey, these decisions that are made out here, they're based on organizational habits. There's a habit of the way organizations like to make decisions. And these habits are based on the culture. And so that began a whole movement on trying to figure out organizational culture, what's the best culture for how we make decisions, and those forms of things. So culture begets a certain set of habits organizationally that beget a certain way that decisions are made. And so what happens is, and Charles Duhigg explored this a bit, is most organizations start making what they think are rational decisions, but because they're steeped in these habits based on an organizational culture, they may not be the right decisions for what they need to do, right? I mean, take an example of Microsoft missing the boat in some of the stuff that went on. There was probably decisions that went